A world not so long ago. What if I told you there was a time when doctors smoked beside their patients, school children feared the cane, and grabbing a pint during your lunch break was just part of the routine? This isn't ancient history. This was Britain, just a few decades ago. From hospital wards heavy with cigarette smoke to highways with no speed limits, from children buying fireworks at the corner shop to hitchhiking teens trusting total strangers, this was once the everyday life of an entire generation. It was a country more relaxed, less regulated, and sometimes dangerously free. Back then, rules felt more like suggestions, and customs were born out of habit rather than policy. It was a society where personal choice often trumped public safety, and community trust replaced formal control. Parents sent their kids to buy beer, builders drank on the job, and nobody wore a seatbelt unless they wanted to. Looking back now, these habits feel unthinkable, even shocking, but for those who lived it, it was just normal life. So how did we get from there to here? In this journey through time, we'll uncover 16 things that were once perfectly acceptable in Britain, but today would spark outrage, lawsuits, or both. Some will make you laugh, others will make you gasp, but all of them remind us just how much a society can change, sometimes in the blink of a generation. If you believe these forgotten moments are worth remembering, hit that subscribe button. Help keep these stories alive, not just for nostalgia's sake, but to understand how far we've come and what we've left behind. The strange normal of yesterday. It's almost hard to believe now, but there was a time in Britain when the hospital wasn't just a place of healing. It was a smoky, gray-tinted world where the scent of antiseptic mingled with cigarette smoke, and ashtrays sat proudly in waiting rooms. Patients lit up in their beds. Visitors smoked at the bedside. Even doctors took cigarette breaks in staff lounges, with no sense of irony. But was it truly as careless as it seems? Back then, smoking was culture. It was social. It was normal. People didn't see it as dangerous. They saw it as relaxing, sophisticated, even therapeutic. Advertisements told them so. Movies told them so. Even their own doctors often agreed. The idea that smoking in a children's ward could be harmful? That thought simply hadn't taken root yet. And it didn't stop at hospitals. Step into a 1970s British office, and you might find employees cracking open a beer at lunch, right at their desks. In factories and shipyards, beer was sometimes provided by the employer to keep morale high. Drinking wasn't taboo. It was a part of the day, like tea breaks or office gossip. Entire industries operated on a rhythm that seems reckless by modern standards, but back then, it was just Tuesday. Then there was the classroom. For generations, discipline in British schools was enforced not just with authority, but with actual pain. Caning, slippers, rulers, all applied to small hands, sometimes in front of classmates. The goal wasn't cruelty, it was control. Teachers believed fear would shape character, and to many parents, that was just how education worked. Why did no one question these norms? Because everyone did it. When something is practiced everywhere, by everyone, it stops being seen. It becomes invisible. It becomes culture. But as society changed through media, science, and rising voices, these normal things started to look less acceptable. Health campaigns painted smoking in harsh new light. Workers began demanding safety and respect. And children, finally, were seen as humans, not just future citizens in need of shaping. What we once accepted now seems shocking, and what was once invisible now feels impossible to forget. If stories like these open your eyes or spark memories, hit subscribe. Let's preserve the past, not to romanticize it, but to learn from it. Because culture doesn't change overnight. It changes story by story, rule by rule, moment by moment. When the rules began to shift, change doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it starts as a whisper, a campaign poster, a televised public service announcement, or a tragic news story that lingers just long enough to stir the public conscience. In Britain, many of the cultural norms we now find unthinkable began to crack under the pressure of awareness. Take smoking, for instance. The habit didn't vanish overnight, but throughout the 1980s and 90s, the narrative changed. Public health campaigns began linking smoking to cancer in bold, undeniable terms. Cigarette packages started carrying warnings. Television ads turned from glamorizing smoke to exposing its dangers. And slowly, people began to see it not as classy, but as a threat. Hospitals were among the first to react. Policies shifted quietly at first. A no smoking sign here, a designated smoking area there. But by the mid-90s, indoor smoking bans swept through the healthcare sector. It wasn't just about protecting patients. It was about shifting the entire atmosphere of care from haze to healing. Meanwhile, the roads were becoming battlegrounds for change too. For decades, cars didn't require seatbelts, and speed limits were more of a suggestion than law, especially on rural highways. It wasn't uncommon for children to stand between the front seats or even sit on a parent's lap while driving. But a rise in fatal crashes, often involving unbelted passengers, pushed lawmakers to act. The 1983 law mandating seatbelts in the front seats was met with resistance at first, seen by some as an infringement on personal freedom. But as accident data mounted, the public mood turned. Today, it's second nature. In schools, the shift came more slowly, but just as powerfully. A growing chorus of educators, psychologists, and parents began challenging the use of corporal punishment. What was once seen as discipline was now framed as violence. By 1986, corporal punishment was banned in state schools. Not long after, private institutions followed suit. These weren't isolated decisions. They were cultural turning points, and they weren't without backlash. Every shift in norms brought resistance from those who remembered the old ways fondly. But as time passed, those ways began to feel less like tradition and more like risk. If you're finding value in this journey through forgotten British customs, hit subscribe. These stories matter, not just for nostalgia, but for understanding how we evolve as a society. When society caught up as rules changed, so too did daily life, but not without friction. For many, the sudden clampdown on familiar habits felt intrusive. In offices where lunchtime pints had long been a perk, the introduction of stricter workplace policies sparked grumbles. What happened to trust? Some asked. Factory floors that once echoed with the clink of beer bottles were now lined with posters about safety, sobriety, and productivity. What was once camaraderie became policy, and not everyone welcomed the shift. In homes, parents who had grown up riding unbelted in the back of vans struggled to adjust to the new child seat mandates. Some saw it as overprotective, even ridiculous. But insurance rates and hospital visits told another story. Over time, the sight of a wiggly toddler strapped into a padded car seat became not just common, but expected. Children themselves were perhaps the most visible part of this transition. In the classroom, the removal of corporal punishment didn't just end physical discipline, it forced educators to find new tools. Emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, and positive reinforcement replaced the slipper and cane. Not all teachers were equipped for this new reality. Some retired early, others struggled. But for students, it marked the beginning of a school culture focused on understanding over obedience. And what about the public spaces? Gone were the days of teenagers casually drinking in parks or dogs roaming neighborhoods like furry local celebrities. Local councils began enforcing bylaws, open container rules, leash laws, noise ordinances. While these measures made cities cleaner and arguably safer, they also chipped away at the spontaneity of life. What had once been live and let live became license and limit. Yet amid all this change, something unexpected happened. People adapted, reluctantly at first, then completely. Pubs began offering alcohol-free options. Offices instituted wellness programs. Seatbelt compliance soared. And most children today can't imagine a world where teachers hit students or smoking was allowed indoors. If this glimpse into Britain's cultural growing pains intrigues you, hit that subscribe button. These stories help us understand how societies change and what we gain or lose along the way. Lessons from the shadows of the past. Looking back, it's easy to scoff. Smoking in hospitals, teachers with canes, beer on the job. It all seems absurd now, but to judge the past only by today's standards is to miss the deeper lesson. What we normalize shapes who we become. Britain's mid-20th century habits were more than just quirky anecdotes. They reflected a society that valued trust, autonomy, and resilience, sometimes to a fault. The freedom to drink in public, to discipline children as one saw fit, or to let a dog roam the neighborhood wasn't seen as neglect, but as personal responsibility. And yet many of those freedoms came at a cost. Illnesses linked to smoking, road fatalities from lax seatbelt laws, lifelong trauma from school beatings. These weren't just statistical side effects, they were lived consequences. That's why change came. Slowly, awkwardly, often with resistance, but it came. What's fascinating is what remained. Not all cultural shifts erase the spirit they replaced. While public drinking declined, the pub still holds sacred space in British social life, just with more rules and far less risk. While corporal punishment ended, the emphasis on structure and discipline found healthier expressions in restorative practices. Even in safety regulations, the spirit of British practicality persists. Seatbelt laws might be enforced, but rarely without a bit of grumbling. The deeper legacy, a cultural memory that now serves as a mirror. Older generations remember these dangerous freedoms with a mix of nostalgia and relief. Younger generations, hearing these stories, often react with disbelief. This contrast is valuable. It shows how fast norms evolve, and how every society, no matter how advanced, will one day be judged by what it tolerates today. And that's the real lesson. What feels normal now may one day feel outrageous. So as we move forward, perhaps we shouldn't just ask, how could they live like that? Maybe we should ask, what will people say about us in 50 years? If you believe that remembering the past helps us shape the future, hit subscribe. These aren't just quirky stories. They're warnings, reminders, and sometimes second chances. Was that really the whole story? We've journeyed through smoky hospital wards, boozy lunch breaks, wild highways, and playgrounds that doubled as boot camps. We've seen a Britain that once prized freedom over safety, familiarity over fairness, and habit over health. And now, as we look back, we're left with one question. Was it really better or just different? For some, the past holds a strange comfort. Back then, they'll say, we knew how to raise kids. We trusted our neighbors. We didn't need laws to tell us what was right. There's truth in that, but also danger. Nostalgia can be selective. It remembers the freedom, but not always the consequences. It misses the bruises left by rulers, the coughs behind the hospital curtains, or the quiet anxiety of a child riding in the back seat, unbuckled, while the car sped toward uncertainty. And yet, perhaps there's something to reclaim. Not the risks, but the resilience. Not the recklessness, but the responsibility. What if the lesson of this past isn't that we were wrong to change, but that we risk losing something vital in the process? Community, simplicity, trust. Those values didn't disappear. They just became harder to hold on to in a world of policies, procedures, and protective barriers. Maybe the real challenge for modern society isn't avoiding the mistakes of the past, but learning how to preserve its best spirit without repeating its worst habits. Because culture never stops changing. Today's norms, the apps we depend on, the data we share, the screens we trust to raise our kids, may one day feel just as absurd as letting children buy fireworks or smoke-filled doctors' lounges. So we end not with a conclusion, but with a question. What will future generations find shocking about us? What normal thing today will become tomorrow's cautionary tale? And most importantly, will anyone be around to remember it all? If you want to be part of that memory, hit subscribe. Let's keep these stories alive, not just to reminisce, but to reflect. Because sometimes the strangest stories are the ones we lived ourselves. But that might not be the whole story.